There is a version of you that existed 5 years ago who would not recognize the person reading this sentence right now. Not your face, not your job title. Something deeper. The way you flinch at certain words. The things you no longer bother explaining to people. The dreams you quietly stopped mentioning out loud. Somewhere between then and now, without a single dramatic moment to mark it, you became someone else. And the strange part is, you helped build that person without ever agreeing to the plan. We like to imagine identity as something solid, a core self that stays intact while life happens around it. But the truth is stranger and a little more unsettling. Identity is not a monument, it is a residue. It is what's left over after 10,000 small moments quietly vote on who you are. Think about the last time you made a decision under pressure. You didn't consult some fixed inner constitution. You reacted, and that reaction, repeated enough times, became a pattern. And the pattern, repeated enough times, became a personality trait. And the personality trait, left unquestioned long enough, became your identity. Nobody handed you a script. You wrote it accidentally, one repeated moment at a time. Psychologists have a name for part of this. It's called the mere exposure effect, and it doesn't just apply to songs you didn't like at first or faces you grew used to. It applies to versions of yourself. The more often you behave a certain way, the more familiar that behavior feels. And the brain, which prizes familiarity over almost everything else, starts mistaking familiar for true. You didn't become cautious because caution was who you always were. You became cautious because you got hurt once, protected yourself twice, and by the 10th time, caution had quietly filed itself under permanent record. Here's the uncomfortable part. Most of who you are right now is not the result of grand decisions. It's the result of defaults. The path of least resistance, walked so many times it wore itself into a groove you now mistake for bedrock. Consider a person who used to speak up in every room. Somewhere along the way, one idea got dismissed a little too harshly, then another. Not cruelly, just enough. And slowly, without ever deciding to become quiet, they became quiet. Ask them today why they don't share their thoughts anymore, and they'll say, "That's just not who I am." But it was who they were, until the evidence stopped supporting it, and their brain, always economical, updated the file without asking permission. This is where things get genuinely strange, because the brain doesn't just record what happens to you, it tries to protect the story it's already written. This is called identity protective cognition, and it means that once you've settled into a version of yourself, you start unconsciously defending that version even when it's costing you. If you've decided you're not a risk taker, you won't just avoid risks, you'll seek out reasons to avoid them so the story stays consistent. If you've decided you are the strong one in your family, you'll suppress your own exhaustion, not because you're not exhausted, but because breaking character feels more threatening than breaking down. The self doesn't just live in you, it defends itself, like it has something to lose. And in a way it does, because if the story changes, you have to admit that the last version of you was in some sense a role you were playing without knowing it. This raises the real question underneath all of this. If so much of your identity was built by accident, through repetition, avoidance, and quiet self-protection, then how much of what you call yourself is actually chosen, and how much is simply the shape left behind by everything you didn't examine? Think about the language people use when they describe themselves. "I'm just not a morning person. I've never been good with money. I don't really open up to people." Notice how final these statements sound, as though they were discovered rather than constructed. But trace almost any of them back far enough, and you'll usually find an origin point that had nothing to do with permanent nature and everything to do with a handful of ordinary moments that got generalized into a rule. A few sluggish mornings became not a morning person. One financial mistake followed by shame instead of curiosity became bad with money. A single instance of being vulnerable and regretting it became I don't open up. The brain doesn't file these as isolated events, it files them as evidence for a permanent verdict, because a verdict is simpler to carry around than 100 separate memories. And once the verdict exists, something even more consequential happens. You stop testing it. Nobody wakes up and thinks, let me check if I'm still the kind of person who avoids conflict. They simply avoid conflict again, and the avoidance itself becomes the only proof anyone bothers to consult. The original evidence could be years old, could belong to a version of you that no longer has anything in common with who you are today, and it still governs your behavior, quietly, from behind the scenes, like a law nobody remembers voting for, but everyone keeps obeying. There's a concept from narrative psychology that explains why this feels so disorienting. Human beings don't just live their lives, they narrate them. We take a chaotic stream of moments and stitch them into a story with a beginning, a struggle, and a through line, because a story is easier to live inside than raw uncertainty. The danger is that once the story is written, we start living to protect the plot instead of living to reflect the truth. You don't examine whether you're actually anxious, you just play the part of the anxious one, because the script says that's your line. This is why change feels so much harder than logic suggests it should be. It's not that people can't behave differently, it's that behaving differently feels like betraying a character they've spent years building, even when that character was assembled from fear, convenience, and moments they never chose to have meaning. But here's where the discomfort turns into something useful. If identity is built this way, quietly, through repetition and unexamined defaults, then it can also be rebuilt this way. Not through some singular, dramatic reinvention, through the same mechanism that built the old identity in the first place. Small, repeated moments, chosen consciously this time instead of accidentally. Consider what happens when someone starts making one different choice under pressure. Not a huge one, a small one. They speak when they'd normally stay silent. They rest when they'd normally push through out of guilt. At first, it feels false, like wearing someone else's clothes. That discomfort is not a sign you're doing it wrong. It's a sign you're doing it, because familiarity was never truth. It was just repetition wearing a disguise. This is the quiet, almost unglamorous secret behind real change. Nobody transforms in a single moment of clarity, no matter how the story gets told afterward. They repeat something different long enough that the brain updates its default, the same slow, invisible mechanism that built the old identity in the first place, now working in the opposite direction. This also explains why the people who seem to change most convincingly are rarely the ones chasing a total reinvention. They're usually the ones who picked one specific behavior and stayed boring about it. Not a new personality, not a new philosophy of life recited to anyone who listened, just the same small adjustment repeated on the days it felt natural and, more importantly, on the days it didn't. The days it doesn't feel natural are not the exception to the process, they are the process. That is precisely when the old default is being overwritten, because the brain only updates its assumptions about you when your behavior contradicts them under real conditions, not comfortable ones. There's also a quieter cost to consider, one that rarely gets mentioned. Every year you spend performing a version of yourself you never consciously chose is a year that version gets a little more expensive to leave. Not because change becomes impossible, but because the surrounding life, the relationships, the routines, the identity others have come to expect from you all start to lean on that version being permanent. This is not a reason to stay, it's a reason to notice sooner rather than later, while the cost of writing something different is still small enough to pay without flinching. Which brings us back to the person you've become without realizing it. They are not a mistake, they were not built by weakness, they were built the only way any self is ever built, out of repetition, protection, and the stories we tell ourselves to make an unpredictable life feel coherent. But built is the key word, not fixed, not final. Built, the way anything built by repeated small choices can be rebuilt by repeated small choices. You are not required to keep living as the accidental sum of every moment you never questioned.
You are allowed to look at the person you've quietly become, the one shaped by defaults, protection, and stories you never consciously chose, and start writing new lines on purpose. Not because the old version was false, but because it was never truly finished. It was only ever a draft, mistaken for a final copy. And maybe that's the real revelation. You didn't lose control of who you became. You simply never realized you were the author the entire time. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this gave you a new way of seeing yourself, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. If it resonated, tap like. It genuinely helps this channel grow. And I'd love to know, what's one habit or belief about yourself that you suspect was built by accident rather than by choice? Leave it in the comments. If this made you think differently about who you are, you'll probably want to watch our video on the hidden psychology of comfort zones next. It picks up right where this one leaves off.